All right, so now I'll turn it over to Mr. Zegers.
See, the last time in my life I'll get to be Mr. Zegers. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kip Zegers, and I taught at Hunter High for 33 years, from 1984 to 2017. When I first met the class of 91 as 8th graders, I was a brand new teacher. Now, here we are. I've read both of the books under discussion today. Each book left me impressed and, as a Hunter person, proud. As you will hear, the books have much in common. I was impressed with the way Amy Song creates a moving column of women, rebels, and thinkers. The story builds, and anyone reading today, especially younger women, can feel herself standing on the shoulders of accomplishment and prowess. Emily Bass's book on AIDS in Africa is amazing in showing both tenacious and clever activists and in revealing the details of policy and the making of policy, its failures and success. It is both a history and a primer for young activists. We're going to start by giving each author 10 minutes to speak about her work. Then I will have questions for each. Then I will see if they want to ask each other a question. At about an hour, we'll hear questions from the chat. Let's begin in alphabetical order with Emily Bass. Emily, of course, is Hunter class of 91. She spent 20 years as a journalist and advocate focused on AIDS in Africa. Her writing has been published in the Washington Post, N+1, I read that one, The Lancet, and Esquire. And of course, she has this wonderful book, To End a Plague. Emily, you got 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. I'm training myself to call Mr. Zegers Kip, but it does not come naturally. I learned how, joy, it's contagious. I learned how to be a writer in Mr. Zegers' classroom, and I learned how to be a writer at Hunter, and I learned how to be someone who thought across disciplines. And so of the many events that I have done and I'm doing, this event has a real special meaning. So thank you, Kinshasa and the Alumni Association, for organizing this. It's really, really meaningful to me to be here. I also got taught at Hunter to be something of a contrarian. So, or maybe I arrived as a contrarian and it didn't get removed or something. But I'm going to read from a section that I think generally people felt was a little dense. And I'm going to tell you why I'm going to read from that section. George Bush in 2003 changed the course of American global health history and AIDS history when he launched the single largest disease-specific pandemic fighting program in American history and in world history to this day. And it was called PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And the book, I was an AIDS activist at the time that this started, and was sort of knocking around and kind of getting my feelings hurt by girls I was trying to go out with, and that didn't work so well. And I thought, oh, I'm going to write a memoir about getting my feelings hurt in the context of an AIDS epidemic, and realized that actually what was important was, I mean, my feelings are deeply important, just ask my mother who's here somewhere, but was the history that was unfolding, what it meant for America to take on a plague, a pandemic beyond its borders, what it meant that this was impelled by transnational activists, what it meant that after it launched, and that it was given to us by a man who was also launching the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan at the exact same time. So essentially granting, what many people considered a war criminal, granting the fondest wishes of a deeply activist, anarchist, queer movement. That was interesting to watch. And I moved to Uganda to see what was going to happen. And this book is the result. Now, the part I'm going to read you from is not the beginning, and it's not George Bush. It's actually, to me, one of the most amazing things about it is not that Bush launched it, but that it endured. And it endured through now 4 presidents and 9 Congresses. I'm going to read to you from a section that is in 2007, 2008. It's a 5-year program. So it's the moment in which the program is up for reauthorization. PEPFAR is enacted by law every 5 years. And it up for reauthorization is a moment to examine and unpack and look at the elements in the law and see what to do about various elements. And it's a moment of horse trading. PEPFAR, the program, the first time that it was authorized, $15 billion, most of which was earmarked to provide treatment to Black and brown people in poor countries who had what is largely a sexually transmitted disease. Put all of that together and think about that in the context of the Bush administration. Just like, let that, we do this, right? $15 billion, 50,000 people in Africa living with HIV have treatment when George Bush announces this. He says, I want 2 million on treatment. PEPFAR meets and exceeds those targets year after year after year. The money is obtained and the program is launched on the basis of a deal brokered on an agreement not to, an agreement about women's bodily autonomy. And that's, I think, where Amy and I come together in these books, right? And in this inquiry. So in order to get the $15 billion, Republicans and Democrats alike agree that none of the money from PEPFAR is going to be able to be spent on contraception, comprehensive sexuality and reproductive health education, or anything that has anything to do with basically women below the waist. So you segment women into the virus, if they have it, HIV, and into their sexual and reproductive selves and lives. And any woman living with HIV in a PEPFAR country will tell you she's had to choose between getting her contraception and getting her medication. And these details come back to the fore during reauthorization in a sort of thorny legislative section that is a little bit tough going, but it's like your vegetables, like this is how stuff gets done. And we're going to make laws about pandemic preparedness, pandemic prevention. They're being made right now. And I predict and warn that they will be made on the backs of women's bodies once again. And so it is worth knowing how these things work. So I'm going to read this section, done talking, watching the clock. And it is a family. So I moved to Uganda to report this book in 2004, and I then would go back and forth for 18 years and visiting the same people. And this is a family, a very poor family in urban Kampala. The father is named Tata, the teenage daughter is named Peace, the mother is named Mama Apollo, and I have gone back to visit them in 2007, which is about 3 years after I met them. There may be other things, but I'll explain it as I go along. She did it for chapatis, Tata said bitterly when I returned in July 2007. Peace stared at the ground. Moments earlier, it had been one of the best days I had ever spent in the small brick house. Peace had, for once, come out from behind the curtain. She stood in the small main room, cutting up a red onion with the knife with the wobbly blade, dropping the pieces into the pot that sat on live coals, sizzling with oil. Potatoes and tomatoes sat in neat piles, ready to be turned into a savory sauce. Mama Apollo's voice ricocheted off the walls as it did when she was happy. We are like blood, Tata said of himself and Mama Apollo. We are a family now. Mama Apollo had completed the training. This is a training for an income generation project that was for impoverished women to learn how to make beads that then got sold. And it was an incredibly successful effort for a while there in Uganda. Mama Apollo had completed the training. The house, hung with strips of beads, felt festive and bright. There was food in the baskets behind the curtain. Mama Apollo beamed and Tata held his head up high. And I should say, sorry, also Mama Apollo and Tata both have HIV, as does their youngest child, who's one of two, the surviving one of a pair of twins. And that's how I met them. Mama Apollo and Tata beamed and Tata held his head up high. As for Peace, she never spoke all that much anyway. She was a young woman with a round, full body who seemed to want privacy in a house that offered none. I tried to give it her in the ways I could. I did not ask her too many questions. I did not pry. But that day, because she was standing right beside me, the room so small that my knee grazed her shin, I'd asked why she was home and not at school. You tell her, Tata muttered with surprising bitterness. You tell her. And finally she had. She was pregnant, and though she was not showing, she had stopped going to school. Her teachers mocked her, she said. When she nodded off at her desk, her body feeling the exhaustion of first trimester gestation, they laughed at her. When other girls dozed off, the teachers asked if they wanted to end up just like her. Peace's father said she'd traded her body for food. But when she walked me and my translator up the hill after we left, she explained that it hadn't been quite that way. The boy, whose name was Adam, had shut the door one day when his mother wasn't around. She'd asked him about condoms and he told her he didn't have AIDS. She wasn't worried about AIDS. she'd replied, but she did not want a child. Now she had one on the way. She wanted an abortion and knew where to get one. Tata had told her that if she went looking for one, he would throw her out of the house. As we spoke, we walked up the hill past the women with their tables of fish, pyramids of tomatoes, and piles of small potatoes that many Ugandans called Irish. We passed the tarps piled with knockoff Crocs and slip-on sandals, like the bright orange ones Peace had on her own feet. She put her body between mine and the cars that came careening down the road and told me to keep my hand on my bag, just as Mama Apollo did when she accompanied me on the ascent from the slum up to the main road. I looked at her more fully than I had before. She wore a t-shirt with the insignia of her father's beloved Catholic clinic, atop gray-washed capri jeans, and there was both light and resignation in her eyes. She liked this boy, Adam. Her eyes shone when she said his name. She just didn't like the pregnancy. We passed the clinic as we talked, its yellow gate opening inward. It offered free care to any family member with the card that the clinic had issued to Tata, but other than the t-shirt, it had nothing to offer Peace. Earlier that year, it had begun receiving PEPFAR funding via Catholic Relief Services. The conscience clause written into the original PEPFAR law stipulated that faith-based groups did not have to provide any services or commodities that violated their faith or principles. No condoms, no sexual education, no pregnancy termination. In the proposed reauthorization, this is the law to reenact PEPFAR for the second 5 years, this provision was further strengthened. The clinics did not have to offer the services, and they could not be required to acknowledge that they existed, to provide referrals for requested care. When the closest free clinic did not offer young women and men anything but abstinence until marriage education, pregnancies were inevitable. Pregnant women were at far higher risk of getting HIV than non-pregnant women. Women with HIV who had unplanned pregnancies were more likely to struggle taking their antiretrovirals, leading to a higher viral load. This put their health at risk as well as that of their children. Providing services to plan, prevent, and when absolutely necessary, terminate their pregnancies was, without a doubt, HIV prevention. But when Ken Hackett of Catholic Relief Services appeared at a December 2007 hearing on PEPFAR, Peace was by then large with child, he pleaded with Congress, do not require PEPFAR implementers to offer family planning and reproductive services. In his written remarks, he pushed further. It was not just that the services should not be required, they should not be recognized as something a woman with HIV would need. Catholic Relief Services was, the submitted testimony said, quote, very concerned about efforts to define comprehensive services for HIV positive women as necessarily including family planning and reproductive health services. CRS regrets these efforts and asks that such proposals be rejected. If he was ignored, he warned the committee, millions of people would lose their care. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Amy. It's a continuous history, right? The fear of women's control over their body and the way that it manifests itself through laws and foreign policy, including our efforts to fight plagues, is one that we should all be aware of, and I think can together do something about. Over to you, Amy, and thank you guys.
Emily, that was a good introduction to what you're up to. Amy San, of course, is Hunter class of 91. She's a graduate of Brown University and the author of 5 novels, including Prospect Park West and The Actress, as well as a children's book. This is her first work of narrative nonfiction. Amy started out at New York Press and New York Magazine. She has developed television for places like HBO, Fox, and Lifetime. Raised in Brooklyn Heights, she lives there today with her daughter. Okay, Amy.
The sun is setting, so I'm very concerned about light, but we got time. Oh my gosh, I don't know about you, Emily, but I need glasses. We just had our 30th reunion. So my book is called The Man Who Hated Women, of many reasons I immediately reached out to Emily when her books came out is I love both of our covers, and I think they have a similar vibe going. My book is about Anthony Comstock and 8 women who went up against his Comstock Law, which was passed in 1873. I'll talk a little bit about what the law was, but first I'm going to read 2 very short passages. Anthony Comstock had red mutton chops covering a scar inflicted by an irate smut dealer who stabbed him in the face. He had enormous shoulders, a big chest, short tree trunk legs, a dome-like forehead, light blue-gray eyes, a broad brow, and the build of a fighter. Walking on the balls of his feet, he was short and stout, resembling a New Englander who eats pie for breakfast, dinner, and supper. He favored starched shirts with bow ties. Beneath his clothes, no matter the weather, he wore red flannel underwear. His shoes, which he bought from a police and fireman supply store, were size 13 heavy-soled boots. While crossing the street in New York one day, he was nearly run over by a mail wagon. He shook his badge at the horse and said, "Don't you know who I am? I'm Anthony Comstock." A reporter once called his office and asked an assistant whether Comstock had been punched in the face that morning. The answer was concise, probably. Though my book is called The Man Who Hated Women, it is really about these 8 amazing women who were prosecuted under the Comstock laws, both federal and state. Some of them you've heard of: Margaret Sanger, Emma Goldman, Victoria Woodhull, who ran for president at the age of 34 in 1872, while living with 2 husbands under one roof. But one of the women in my book who you've never heard of is named Ida C. Craddock. And I don't want to be redundant with the passage I'm going to read. Ida went to Friends Seminary in Philadelphia, a still incredibly well-regarded Quaker school today. She was born in 1857. She had a domineering mother who was a widow, and I fell completely in love with her while researching this book. So this passage I'm going to read now is the very first lines of my book. It was the summer of 1893, and Ida C. Craddock was in the Cairo Street Theater at the Chicago World's Fair watching the belly dancers. There were about 12 of them, all in their late teens to early 20s, and as each one performed, the others sat behind them on divans to watch. Musicians played drums, woodwinds, and strings. The Algerian and Egyptian dancers wore ornamented headdresses and tiny symbols on their fingers, knee-length peasant skirts, fringed epaulets, hip belts with vertical fabric flaps, and long beaded necklaces. Black stockings covered their legs. They had white muslin drawers to the knees and high-heeled slippers. Their skirts' waistbands, shaped like coiled snakes, rose only to their hips, and their netted silk undervests were semi-transparent. Spectators could see their navels, as shocking as a camel ride, another attraction at the World's Fair. American women were never seen in public without corsets, much less with their abdomens exposed. Victorian-era dances were led by dancing masters who directed steps and patterns, no improvisation or gyrations. The dancers moved their bellies coyly, clicking castanets and swaying the upper part of their bodies. Some held bottles of water on their heads. Their gyrations grew more agitated and spasmodic as they clapped their castanets faster. Very few made direct eye contact with male audience members. When the performances reached a climax, the women would stand stock still as if seized by something violent and then visibly grow exhausted. Viewers took in the belly dance with bemusement, horror, and titillation. Some cried out, "Disgusting," and fled the theater. The theater was set up so that if you ran out, you actually had to cross in front of the front row in front of the stage. Some men who stayed had looks on their faces that, as Craddock put it, they would have been ashamed to have their mothers or their girl sisters see. To her, those people were Philistines. She was a 36-year-old teacher with brilliant blue eyes. Her complexion was clear, her features cameo cut, and her fingers delicate and tapering. She was living in her domineering mother's Philadelphia living room. Behind a partition she called the cubicle. I think I said Friends Seminary, I meant Friends Central in Philly. After having tried and failed to be the first woman admitted to the University of Pennsylvania's liberal arts program, she had become a lay scholar of comparative religion, reading voraciously at Philadelphia's Ridgeway Library. She was at work on 2 manuscripts, one on the origin of the devil and one on sex worship or sexual symbols in ancient world religions. At the Cairo Street Theater, Ida understood that the belly dancers' thrusts were simulating a woman's movements during intercourse. The bottle of water was an erect penis on the verge of ejaculation, and the extreme self-control was a reference to male continence, or coitus reservatus, a better sex and contraceptive technique in which a man orgasms without ejaculating. When 3 women behind her at the show made sarcastic comments, she turned and said, "If you knew what that dance signifies, you would not make yourselves conspicuous by laughing at it." So those are the 2 sort of poles of my book, this cat and mouse. The cat is Anthony Comstock. And the book begins with the Chicago World's Fair, which Anthony Comstock and Ida Craddock both saw the belly dance, and then goes back in time to Anthony Comstock's arrival in Lower Manhattan, where I am right now, his sort of shock at the incredible amount of pornography, smut peddled on the streets, and streetwalkers, every form of sex work that you could imagine. And then his eventual work with the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, which began as a subcommittee of the Young Men's Christian Association, which was at that time around 15 years old in the United States, and his taking up freelance vice hunting. But my book is really less interested in the, I mean, I could talk for hours about smut in Lower Manhattan and take you on a tour of Ann Street and Warren Street, but it's really interested in these women who were a part of movements that we don't really read about today, either in leftist history or women's history, which were the free love movement and what was known then as the free thinker or free thought movement. These were women who were born roughly between the 1830s and 1870s or so. They are not well known. Some supported suffrage. Some were so radical that they thought that suffrage was too conservative. And in these movements, which I found myself incredibly liberated to learn about, they were provocateurs. They were often even within really, really progressive movements, considered outcasts because of their frank writing around sexuality and birth control. The Comstock Act, which he passed through the support of these blue blood men with last names like Colgate and Morgan. McBurney is a name you may know, but he was actually one of the few self-made guys in the YMCA. The Comstock Act was the first to link obscenity and contraception. We had federal obscenity law at the time, but this law classified birth control, which was called contraception until the term birth control was invented around 1912 in Inwood, classified contraception as obscene, lewd, and lascivious. And what it also did is it penalized the sending of contraceptive information or abortion information with very steep penalties and fines that in some cases sent people into poverty, gave them penalties where they would surely die in prison. And the Comstock Act was passed in 1873, and there's a whole body of literature about the obscenity components of the act. My book is interested in the birth control components. The birth control components of the Comstock Act were not fully overturned. We can have a debate about whether they're still overturned until 1972, 1 year before I was born, and Baird versus Eisenstadt. Griswold versus Connecticut was a case that was brought in Anthony Comstock's home state of Connecticut. And that guaranteed married women the right to be prescribed contraception from their doctor, but it was not until Baird versus that was around, I believe, 1965. It was not until 1972 that a single woman in the United States could obtain contraception from her doctor. I'll leave it there.
Okay, so my first question, I'm going to start with you, Amy, because I just asked you to build on what you've been talking about, and then we'll flip the same question to Emily. What on a personal level made you want to spend so much time with this material and then write this book?
I've discovered the story of Ida Craddock, and I just wanted to tell that story, and I realized that I wanted to do something broader than that, and that the link was going to be these 8 women who went against the laws. On a personal level, Emily and I just had our 30th reunion. We were talking about our feminism. I remember attending, I believe it was 1992, Emily, the birth control, the abortion rights rally in Washington. I think it was 92. I was involved. I was a feminist teenager. I was involved with a bunch of activist groups around birth control, but I don't think I really understood it in a larger way. And when I learned about Comstock's story, I knew that we had slowly been chipping away at reproductive rights in this country for many years, at least around 15 years. But I was just completely inspired by these. I feel like I'm not, you're a tough questioner. I feel like I'm not answering the personal. I wanted to tell a story about women whose writing about sex was a way of writing about other issues. I've always been interested as sex as a proxy for other things that are ultimately much larger and more interesting, and the way that sex is connected to those things. So my book is essentially about the inability of women to experience sexual pleasure in an era where they lived in constant terror of repeated pregnancy and childbirth that at the time were not only economically devastating to them, but on a health and human body level, very, very detrimental. And so what I'm proud of about this book is I'm looking at contraception in the context of women's pleasure.
Okay, I started with that question because your book is really exciting. And as you get deeper into it, there's a momentum to it that I found really compelling. Emily, we know you spent 20 years in AIDS activism. What drew you in the first place and made you want to write this book? You spent 4 years writing the book, and you spent 20 years, a lot of travel, a lot of heartrending experience. What drew you in and what sustained you?
So the very early in the book, I talk a little bit about this, and there's different ways to get to this. I come from a left Jewish activist family. I also have a Southern Episcopalian father who grew up in New Jersey, but I come from my parents are Antioch graduates. That's in the book. I was raised with a left secular Jewish education on Saturdays with Max Kellerman, also class of 91, from the time I was 7. And we were taught to be in solidarity with the struggles of the day, right? So and that was before I realized that just wasn't a thing everybody did. That was in my DNA. So thank you, Mom and Dad. To return to New York City in the mid 90s, which I did after college, was to return to a city that had been living at that point for 15 years with an ongoing plague, and to arrive there as a queer identified social justice activist was to arrive in an AIDS activist moment, a tired AIDS activist moment. Actually, this was the end of years of plague, and I got a job at Out Magazine within weeks of the approval of the first protease inhibitor, which changed the AIDS treatment possibilities to this cocktail or triple combination that turned HIV for people who could acquire the medications from a death sentence into a manageable illness. And so what I then encountered was a very rapid pivot within that movement of some people who realized that there were grotesque inequities in access to the medication. So stop me if this sounds familiar, right? People in America had them if they were wealthy, if they were insured, often if they were white, and you didn't have them if you were Black or brown or you lived in low and middle income countries. And so this activist movement to secure access for all sprung up around me. And I thought some of the people in it were pretty cute. So sometimes I went to the meetings personally because, you know, it was a way to get dates, and I hung around because they won stuff and it was exhilarating. And I just thought that was how activist movements worked. And then they won the big thing from George Bush, and they turned around and they were like, this is terrible. I was like, wait, I thought we won this. I thought can't we be done? Can't we be happy? And I was just, you know, contrarian. Like I said, so I was like, I'm going to move to Uganda and I'm going to see for myself whether Bush is lying and whether America is going to do something. And it turns out that pandemics go on for a really long time and the answers are complex. And so, so I hung around and told the story.
I think for both of you, anybody who reads the books will get answers to the questions I asked that are between the lines. Amy, in your book, other than Ida Craddock, who is your favorite woman and why?
Well, I was going to focus on the New York women, but one of the lesser known women in my book is named Angela Fiducia Tilton Haywood, and she met her husband, Ezra Haywood, who's a fairly well-known free lover, through the abolitionist movement. And they settled in Worcester County, Massachusetts, a town called Princeton, Massachusetts, which was like, I gave a talk in Lenox, Massachusetts. I said the town was kind of like the Kripalu of Worcester County. They ran a country inn where leftists would come for the summers. And they published, Ezra and Angela published this journal called The Word, which was the leading free love journal starting around the 1870s, continuing for about 30 years. And they had 4 children. She had all the children that could watch the births of the younger children. And she was, because for people who don't know about free love and they think that it was invented in 1969 in Woodstock, the free love movement, which flowered beginning in the 1830s, 1840s, and then was very active at the time that Comstock passed his law in 1873, was not about sleeping with as many sexual partners as you could. It was about reforming divorce laws. It was about equal division of domestic labor. And it was about women and men forming relationships that were based on mutuality, respect, and common interests instead of women's economic dependency on men. And Angela really believed in that. She and Ezra, as I said, had 4 children. They were named Psyche, Ceres, Hermes, and Angelo. She dressed one of her boys in long hair, and he was frequently mistaken for a girl. And she was just this incredible proponent of frank language, sex education, and anatomy, which were very difficult for all young people to get. Boys, you know, young brides and grooms. And she had this happy monogamous marriage and outlived her husband by many years. And then I should add, he was prosecuted under the Comstock laws repeatedly and died of illness, most likely contracted in prison. She was never prosecuted under the laws because it was based on who physically mailed the offending items. And her job was sort of co-editor and co-publisher, but Ezra would physically mail the issues at the Princeton post office. So I have one little plug I'll make is I contributed an entry on Angela Haywood to the Encyclopedia of the American Left, which I think a revised edition is coming out later this year. So I'm really happy to bring these women's stories to the history of leftism in our country.
Thank you. Emily, before I ask you your question, would you just to lighten things up, could you quickly tell the story of how Dr. Deborah Birx, who we all saw struggle with Trump, how she stood up to the generals? About promotion? This was a great story.
Sure. I just want to say, I don't know if you saw this, Kinshasa, there's might be people in the waiting room. I'm not sure. That appeared in the chat.
I can't, I have no access.
Got the access to the waiting room. Someone. I cannot figure it out, but I will say this, that Debbie Birx, long before she was the lady with the scars with the thankless task of standing next to Donald Trump at the coronavirus briefings, actually decided to do a residency in the Army because that's where her husband had matched, and then rose through the military as a physician and researcher. And at one point, the generals that were interviewing her for a position said, well, you know, what are you going to do? Which is actually, by the way, illegal. Said, what are you going to do? Are you going to get pregnant? And she said, oh, no, don't worry. My husband and I only have oral sex. And it just shut them up. And, you know, she knew they weren't going to ask anything else. So there you go.
That's a great story. And she and Fauci both appear prominently in your book, and you see a whole side of them. So my question for you is, of all the women you met in Africa and Washington, who had the most impact on you? I think I know the answer, but.
Oh, it's my friend Sissy, for sure. I mean, Sissy is the one person. There are 4 women to whom the book is dedicated, and they're all women living with HIV. And Sissy's the one person who didn't want her surname to be used. It's a very interesting thing, navigating sort of disclosure of identity. It is her real first name, and you could very easily figure out exactly who she is if you wanted to, but this was where she wanted to be. But I met Sissy in 2001, and she had 3 T cells, and I met her at a conference with women for women living with HIV that coincided with 9/11. And my father, who is fine, worked in one of the towers, and so she was there. I got a phone call that the towers had been knocked down, and I dropped the phone and started screaming. And Sissy was one of the people that she got to me first, and something happened in that moment where a white woman with HIV negative woman suddenly in such desperate, dire straits, sort of. I think we had a moment in which we became equals in a way that wasn't necessarily always available, right? If you're dealing with differences in power, HIV status, income, all of these other things. And we've known each other ever since. And she and I have watched each other have families and be women and fight these battles. And she has taught me over and over again how to listen. And that's a lot of what this book was listening.
Okay. Amy, what about your book is relevant to the dreadful year 2021? Let it rip.
Well, I don't want to get too much into the Texas law because, unlike one of our classmates, Jeannie Suk Gerson, I'm not a legal scholar, and I don't want to speak toward the kind of sick, awful impermeability of that law and the way it was crafted. What I learned while researching this book that really surprised me is we frequently think of history as this line toward increasing openness and liberation. In fact, I discovered that abortion rights were stronger in the 1840s than they are today in something like 60 or 70% of this country. There's a historian who I fell in love with while writing this book named Carol Smith Rosenberg, famous feminist historian. And she has written about the fact that abortion restrictions came around at the same time as medical specialization. And essentially what happened was we had a long run in this country of women providing abortions to other women. They were known sometimes as women practitioners and sometimes as women's practitioners. They were both. They were usually educated at homeopathic colleges. I mean, there were very few med schools in the 1840s at all, but there were few that women could go to. And basically what happened is abortion is, while it's the first medical specialty, it is also a business, and you have a constant supply of people who need them. And the men that were founding medical societies and medical colleges realized that there was an enormous swath of business they couldn't get into because it was dominated by women. And so Carol Smith Rosenberg charts really beautifully in her book Disorderly Conduct the way in which they created specialization as a way to take the abortion trade from women and get it for themselves. I guess he started out by saying that abortion rights were better in this country in the 1840s. And part of what I mean is that the very first abortion laws that began to restrict abortion were about protecting the life of the mother. That was fascinating to me. The laws had to do with quack medicine and bad practitioners. And so they were designed to protect women from botched abortions. It was only after the men came in, and there was a guy in the American Medical Association named Horatio Storer who sort of re-envisioned abortion as something only selfish women did, as a shirking of marital duty, familial duty, that it began to be kind of demonized in a religious way. And then Anthony Comstock still didn't come along for another 35 years. So yeah, so that surprised me.
So 2021, things change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always been a divide in terms of wealthier women's ability to get abortion and less wealthy women. And that was true in the 1840s and beyond, and it's true today. Although I think what we're seeing is we're seeing a real division based on geography. And geography is based on so many things, family ties and these other things. And it seems, I fear that for those of us who are geographically protected and don't think about these things every day, the laws that have been happening for 15 years, restrictions on medical abortion and parental consent and all these other ways in which Roe has been chipped away at. I think a lot of, depending on where you live, you may not experience that. And so we're seeing this real divide where you're penalized on the basis of where you live. And I think it's absolutely horrifying. And I don't know if Emily wants to weigh in on this, but one of the things I wonder about is, what is it really about? I mean, Anthony Comstock, his opinions were consistent with his religious ideology. And is this attack on reproductive rights, how much of the money that's behind it is really coming from people who religiously object to it?
Okay, so Emily, your take on that? Your book is really good on,
but I don't want to put you on the spot.
on activism in the streets and about policymaking and actually voting. What does your book tell us about 2021 and what can happen?
Well, it tells us that that the recent past can be completely forgotten, is what I'll tell you. So we are in a moment of that is incredibly it rhymes if you're paying attention with what happened with HIV. We have a global pandemic. It actually is far more of an existential threat to Americans. HIV at the time that Bush launched PEPFAR was seen as a security risk to America, not because of HIV coming to America. HIV was in America largely by that time in the bodies of people that white supremacy considers disposable. So it wasn't that HIV was coming, but that it was going to take out the entire adult generation in countries which were going to become destabilized, and then you were going to have just anarchy and child militias and people firing shoulder rocket launchers. I mean, all of the sort of tropes of African chaos and so it was a security threat. Against that backdrop, America mobilized and launched an incredibly successful, target-driven, well-funded program with a unique structure. They put an ambassador in the State Department, said, you're in charge, meet these targets, get out there and do it. And it sustained bipartisan support, and it worked. And we know it worked. There's a bipartisan bill to fund a major pandemic preparedness and prevention plan that is just sort of sitting in the Senate, going nowhere. Biden held the first COVID summit ever last week. He put in some money. He made some vaccine donations. We don't have targets that we are holding ourselves accountable to. We have not taken leadership. We have not appointed an ambassador. And we also, really importantly, are not seeing, as they hold these summits and they convene these meetings, we are not seeing inclusion of people impacted by pandemics. And the reason that you have an HIV response that you have is it's not George Bush, it's the activists who impelled George Bush to take action and then hung around to make sure that what he promised actually happened. And so there's inclusion. You can't have a UN meeting, a WHO meeting, a US meeting about HIV without having people living with HIV and people impacted by HIV. There is no one impacted by pandemics, directly impacted by pandemics in these decision-making spaces, whether that's somebody living with long COVID, whether that's somebody living on the front line of a possible zoonotic spillover event, whether that's somebody who's living on the front lines of climate catastrophe. And so we have, what I can tell you about 2021 is it's amnesiac and awfully scary, but that we have proof from the recent past of what can be done. And so we just got to make sure that it gets done again.
I think that's really important. Is there a question you'd like to ask each other that you really would like to hear what the other person has to say about their book or about stuff? Amy?
I was really struck by what you said at the beginning, Emily, about sort of divorcing HIV treatment from sexuality, which seems such a crazy way to think about it. To what extent was this, as you put it, this everything below the waist we're not going to deal with? What was that informed by? Were these cultural religious values around sexuality?
So
around women's sexuality?
This is the Republican, this is the pro-life caucus. This is Jesse Helms, this is Chris Smith. There's all these guys, and somehow people have gotten them to hold literally hold Black African babies with HIV. And so they're like, oh my God, how can we have babies with HIV? We can't have babies with HIV, so we have to treat the mother so their babies don't get HIV, right? So they get very into the idea of treatment, but they are terrified. Everybody, anytime any foreign aid is spent on anything, is terrified that the money is going to be spent on abortion. They're terrified. And they're terrified. I mean, this goes back to the same question, like, what are they terrified about? What I think it is, on some level, it's primal. I think that the fear of women's bodily autonomy, the fear of women's agency is primal and is the black matter of all, not black, the dark matter of all history, right? Is this fear of what women will do, what will happen if women have control over their bodies and their lives. But that's maybe a little bit big picture, but essentially they say, we'll give you $15 billion as long as you promise that not one dime goes to abortion. And that is how the $50 billion gets spent. And it is motivated by it's the same people, it's the same lawmakers, so it's the same motivations that is driving what's happening in Texas, the same agenda, but it manifests in a different way when it comes to foreign aid and aid for HIV, where there was this idea that we could save babies and we could even save women and men's lives, and we could just do that without dealing with other health issues.
Okay.
My question's really different. What is like your favorite thing that you found that you couldn't find a way to fit into your book?
Good one.
I had to cut 8,000 words. Google Elmina Drake Slenker, Slenker. She was a Snowville, Virginia Quaker turned atheist who was prosecuted for obscenity because she was I feel like they were kind of a precursor to message boards. She was engaged in kind of an intellectual dialogue with a lot of men, many of whom were doctors, around sexual tendencies. And they would exchange these letters. I, having read these letters, think many of them were fictitious, that people were writing fantasies. And Elmina was very innocent in a certain way and didn't understand that when someone says, you know, I peeked through a hole in the wall and can you imagine what I saw? Maybe they're saying what they hope they saw.
Yeah.
But she was in her 70s or 80s and was prosecuted because she was in a circle in which she was one of the only non-doctors and one of the only women. And she basically got the William Kunstler of his time, a guy named Ed Chamberlain, the good New York lefty lawyer, to come down. And the way he got her off the charges was because he said he was able to prove that she was not aware that the materials she was sending were obscene. And this is a big aspect of the Comstock law, that you had to know that they were obscene. And of course, she felt that she was engaged in this kind of intellectual conversation. And she was decoyed by these local vice agents who came to her cabin in Snowville. And she was just so innocent. She went into her cabinets and turned over all these materials and said, you know, you can do what you want. And she said, call Isaac at the mill, you know. And this just shows the reach of the law. You know, Anthony Comstock understood that women actually in general made more sympathetic witnesses than men, and he went after far fewer women than men. But when he did go after these women, they were often cut from the same cloth. They were intellectuals, they were thinkers, and there was something about them that really offended him and disgusted him. And they were all pushing the envelope in ways we can't even imagine, because they didn't even have knowledge. I mean, they didn't even understand how everything worked. There was a time at which a lot of the sex manuals and marriage guides that I've read from this period urge women they tell you that the safest time of the month to have sex is the middle of the cycle. Can you imagine, like, even if you were taking the advice of these so-called experts, they'd completely screw you. So there was just a real, you know, there was a real lack of sound information.
Okay, so we're now a half hour from the time we have to leave this virtual room. And Kinshasa, do you have any questions from the chat to pass out?
Unfortunately, I have no access to the chat. There's
Oh,
something
no.
wrong with my Zoom interface. My mic appears that I'm muted, but you can hear me. And I honestly cannot see any of the questions in the chat. I cannot see who's in the waiting room. I'm so sorry.
Oh my God.
If people want to try, I mean, most of the things I'm seeing are like people saying hello.
Yes, that's
Someone
what I'm
asked how
saying.
they can get a book agent. But do people just want to chat us? Because the three of us can read them.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's just pause a second. This is the Hunter Crew, and Hunter Crew not known for keeping their mouths shut. I once had a student teacher from Barnard College who was a Hunter girl, and her roommate came and visit me at the high school, and she said, I think I've met everyone in the class of blank. The one thing they have in common is they all think they know everything. So let's have some questions.
And if you're having trouble chatting, maybe do it to Emily or Kip or me.
I can see the thing. You can also raise your hands, and I'm just confused. Do we not know everything, Mr. Zegers? Because I mean, that's like,
Well, you did in 1992, but
well, I know. Lucky
it
me.
ended. So
I can't tell if people are being shy or having technical problems. So maybe we should go to like you said, Emily, hand raising. old school hand raising.
You can use the little icon if you want to.
Everybody knows how to put up a hand on in the reactions on the bottom of your page. You can put up a hand. It says raise hand. And maybe, okay. Irv Kagan has a question.
So,
Johnson, can you unmute somebody who has a question?
I
Oh, he's
can't.
unmuted. All right. But can't keep taking down. All right.
so one question I had was, Emily, have you hooked up with also Hunter alum Sarah Schulman at all?
Oh,
And I know her book is getting a lot of attention. I have not read it. I've read some interesting reviews of it, but it sounds as sort of like in the same area in terms of activist politics and like dynamics and who led and who was the grassroots the most important part. And then also for Amy, I was wondering, were the facts so good here that you opted not to write a novel about this, but you had to write a history because you couldn't improve on these characters?
Okay, Emily, do you remember the first part?
I totally remember the first
question. Teachers aren't supposed to do that. Yeah.
I just really want to shout out that Mish Kim is completely representing with holy shit, Mr. Kagan in the chat. So in case you're not checking, like, thank you, Mish, for being you for all these years. That is awesome. Yeah, no. So I've known Sarah for years, and we are in touch, and I hope to do events with her. And what I will say is really, really interesting, right? Is that like, the first piece that I wrote about this, it's interesting to me, let me not say, but is that the transnational AIDS activism that is very American, queer, DIY, Philly anarchists living in West Philadelphia, those of us in New York that could somehow hold down day jobs and do this at night, using the Time Warner buildings, Xerox machines, that wasn't me, to do flyers, that is not part of the AIDS activist history that most Americans know. So it's really seen as AIDS activism, how to survive a plague, getting the drugs, these heroes, and then George Bush does the next thing. And so the idea that this book is a history of activism is one that's kind of really hard to convey. And like I marched into my local bookstore because my book and Sarah's were both there, and it's like, oh my God, this is so excited. And they were like, well, but her book's about activism and yours is about Africa. And I think that one of the things that we all need to understand, and I mean we don't need to, but I guess one of the things there's a relevance here that to this book that is beyond what I would want, right? Americans can do activism that changes global health. Like they can, and they do, and we can change global health policy, and in this case, it will save our lives, right? And so there's a chapter of AIDS activist history that this is the sequel to Sarah's book, and in a lot of ways, and her book is sort of the prequel to How to Survive a Plague. And if you read them together, and then the band played on, but when it becomes about global health and foreign policy, we lose the thread. And there's a woman, an amazing first African-American political science PhD named Dr. Pearl Alice Marsh, who wrote the first PEPFAR law, the legislative aid for Tom Lantos. And she coined this phrase, grassroots statecraft, which is basically like citizens can make foreign policy. Citizens can write the laws. We can change things, and we can do it for global health. And right now, like our lives depend on it. So that's, I am in that canon with Sarah, but it's not as obvious, but it will be, because you guys are all going to read the book and then you're going to tell everybody. Thank you for asking, Mr. Kagan. Over to you, Amy.
You're muted. Okay.
Mr. Kagan, yeah, Mr. Kagan, I mean, it never occurred to me to write historical fiction. To me, that's the worst of both worlds. Coming at this from the perspective of a fiction writer, you think to yourself, oh, I don't have to figure out how it ends. And then 5 years later, I'm, in archives in the Midwest, and, I've spent my entire advance, and because I've cobbled out these, this is like a total humble brag, but I mean, I got to go to these residencies to write the book. And so what I didn't realize is that the research component would be so exhaustive. I wish that we didn't have to end note to death. I think that women nonfiction writers are held to a higher standard than men, unfortunately. And so the book is end noted to death. I think that readers should be like, yeah, you did 5 years of work. Like, I can trust that the sourcing's there, and just do straight bibliography. But yes, the autocratic Anthony Comstock, I always forget, who is it? Is Javert, and who's the other person from Les Mis? Javert, and it has that they chased each other across the continent, and he figured so prominently in her imagination, to the point that I didn't even get into this, but she had a husband who was dead, with whom she had mind-boggling sex for 8 years and wrote like 800 pages about it. And sometimes when she was lying there after her mind-boggling sex with her ghost husband, she would think about Anthony Comstock and how he was going to come after her and stop her from selling her books. So this was someone who got into the imagination and the subconscious of the people women that he went after on a level that's hard to imagine. One of the reasons I found him so compelling is that he was known. He interacted with the people he went after. He was in court with them frequently. And so as a novelist, you look for those kinds of things. And so as a narrative nonfiction writer, you try to find those novelistic moments of when they interacted with each other. Getting so many questions here. Should we go with raised hands, or
Just everybody look at
Christina
me, sad,
Boylan
have a
wanted
moment
to
of
say
being back in
something?
high school. It's so funny. This is
What's awesome is that class of 91 just really loves to swear. So keep on cursing in the chat.
Oh, thank you, Jean Valjean.
That's
Christina,
fucking
did you
awesome.
All right,
want
I'm
us?
not gonna be shy. And I'm in my kitchen, sorry, but in a very liberated way, to not make noise. Okay, yeah, I want you to know that I'm teaching pandemics and history this fall, and using, a video clip of you, Emily, and I will be mentioning your book in American Women's History in the Spring. Amy, this is fantastic stuff to work with. And the endnotes are awesome, because then for all the naysayers who, say, oh, you're just making this up, this is politically correct, it's like, yo, here's the evidence. So thank you for putting all that legwork in. And what I wanted to ask, and sort of typed in a garbled way, was, for both of you, and I had to step away, so if you've answered this already, I apologize. Can you give us some examples? Like, so very often it's the people on the ground, the grassroots activists, who actually like figure things out and find solutions. Can you give us some examples from your research of women and their allies who, kind of some good news stories, who figured out how to do things like improve women's health, even in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where there's so much danger from unsafe, pregnancy and malnutrition and who knows what else. And similarly, women in different parts of Africa and their allies who are keeping their communities safer because they've used observation, their activism. Are there some examples you'd like to share with us? And thanks so much again.
Go ahead, Em.
I mean, I think it's a great question. Thanks, Christina. I mean, I think that, the one of the things that's interesting to me, that stood out for me in the book. So there's a woman named Lillian Mareko, who's another person the book's dedicated to, and is a dear friend, and is a woman living with HIV. And she first got her treatment because the guy that she was working for wrote a budget line for her treatment into a grant from the UK government, and basically said, you have to pay for her treatment because she's my office manager, and if she dies, I don't have an office manager, so we got to treat her. And so she was living in an era, she survived an era where not unlike the Holocaust, anybody, and I don't make that comparison lightly, people who survived because of happenstance and because of chance and because of random connection. And she has treatment, and it's years later. She has a certain nostalgia for that era, not because people were dying, but because people were solving. Before there are biomedical solutions, there are community solutions, and those community solutions involve people impacted going from one place to another and figuring out how to share information and share strategies. And those strategies are inadequate without the biomedical. But what happens when the biomedical emerges is that the funding for those community-based strategies disappears. And so I think that where there is hope and where there is resilience is not when we're exploiting communities and saying, oh, you're so resilient, just go house to house and help each other. It's saying, here are the biomedical tools, take those, or the communities taking the biomedical tools and putting them into programs that fit and meet their needs. And I think that with abortion on the line, with restrictive abortion, with honestly, with lockdowns in Africa, with COVID and loss of income, what you're seeing is a resurgence of community solutions. I think we're going to see mail order abortion pills. I think we're going to see underground abortion coming back. I think we're going to see community-based and initiated solutions. And what we need to do is to begin to understand that these should not be guerrilla. They should not be when there is nothing, that they are actually the source of sort of sustainable, impactful interventions.
I'll just read like one or two sentences that kind of answer the question about the activists in my book. Despite their extraordinary contributions to the civil liberties, most of the sex radicals have been written out of feminist history. They were too sexual. Sex history, they were not doctors. And progressive history, they were women. Nonetheless, they were the connective tissue between 19th century abolitionism and 20th century free speech. So basically what I argue in this book is that what began as anti-Comstockism in the 19th century, which was a little too narrow for, a little too radical for some free thinkers because they felt that sexual speech should not necessarily be defended, did eventually pave the way for a group called the Free Speech League, and then its successor, which was called the American Civil Liberties Union. And so to me, what was fascinating is there's this kind of untold story of the way that sex speech made way for free speech. And the idea that all speech should be defended, even unpopular speech, and even speech that personally disgusted or offended you, that was sort of made possible by this really, really bold sex writing of these women who, I should point out, although all the women in my book are white, Emma Goldman's the only Jewish person in my book, and the suffrage movement, we now know there were different kinds of suffrage, and the 19th Amendment was only enfranchised a small portion of American women. But what astounded me over and over again was that these women were doing all this when they couldn't vote. And Anthony Comstock was appointed. He couldn't be voted out. And this is an incredible testimony for the power of progressive thinking outside of the ballot box.
Yvonne had a question, which was basically the same one I asked Amy about stuff that, what was I sorry to leave out? What did I wish I could fit in? And like, there's a lot of stuff. Some of it I did, Deb Burks is a protagonist in the book, and she was a protagonist in my life for 20 years. So there's a great deal of stuff that I learned that has to do with amateur radio and her family that I didn't put in because who had the time, but more seriously, and this again, this sort of pertains to all of our lives. One of the reasons we don't have, there's lots of stuff that's broken about the public health system, but we don't have good systems for collecting and sharing national health information. And I went down a whole wormhole, and I couldn't include it in the book, but or most of it in the book. But after apartheid, a group of Scandinavian Scandinavian computer programmer anti-apartheid activists moved to South Africa, and their form of anti-apartheid activism, their form of social justice activism, was to build something called the District Health Information System, which was the first sort of open source, open code system for collecting medical records. And they did it because the South African medical system prior to that was racialized. And it was so what got counted is what gets paid for. And if you're not counting tuberculosis deaths or malaria or any number of infections in Black people, and you're kind of counting them in colored people, and you're really counting them in white people, and you're funding according to that. I mean, that's a very, very oversimplification. But I got just really kind of obsessed with these Scandinavians who'd gone to South Africa and were like, our badass activism is building this open source code, and it is the thing that's used all over sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm kind of obsessed with that, in part because if we're going to prevent future pandemics, we have to have open source systems for sharing information. And then what's crazy is that PEPFAR picked it up, made a version of it, and made it closed. Right. So like but yeah, the history of DHIS, which I keep saying to people, like, I'm going to write that. And even people who know it really well are like, do I have to read that if you write that? So I left it out, but I really love it. Thanks for asking.
Are either of you seeing anything else in the chat?
There
I
is.
see hands raised. Lori
Yeah.
Davidson.
Hi, Amy. So I just want to say that in addition to Amy being an amazing writer, she's also a badass union member at Writers Guild, where I've had the pleasure of interacting with her as an organizer. So I had a question. I'm wondering about how sex workers in the 19th century interacted in this movement, and if there was an alliance with the women who were fighting for the free love or like more of the political rights, or if they were kind of separate from that. Because I feel like there's even today still some, divides among feminists of like whether sex work should be legal or more, fighting for health and safety of sex workers at that time, and how this.
That's a great question. And my editor, who I think is around 28 years old at Farrar Straus, at one point said that I should change all references to prostitutes in my book to sex workers, which I said no, because of the time period and also the nature of sex work in New York in the 1860s and 1870s. Women's wages were so low that many of them supplemented them with sex work, and there was not a clear divide between sex workers and others. There was this whole gray area of people who engaged in some of it to supplement like milliners' wages, factory wages, and that kind of thing. The short answer to your question is that these intellectual movements like free love and free thought were interested in sex work intellectually. There were no sex worker writers that I was able to uncover. It was more like anecdote. They were sort of telling the stories for them. They were more general. It's a really interesting question. And in terms of women's narratives, one of the big mysteries for me that I could almost write another book about is we know a lot about what it was like to be a young man and what was called sporting life. Manhattan at that time was totally targeted towards young single men. And we know that an extraordinarily high number of women did turn to sex work, women between the ages of like 15 and 30. They were living in New York away from their families. But what I don't know a lot about is the everyday lives of single, unattached women in New York at that time. The city was catering to the men, and one of the ways it was catering to them was through selling sex. But I'm interested in, like Anthony Comstock came to New York from New Canaan in 1866 or 1867. What's the story of the girl from New Canaan? What was her experience? And of course, the African-American experience in New York at that time, I'm starting to read about for one of my classes in my graduate program, but that also was not something that the YMCA was, they were operating kind of in their own sphere. So what I was going to say about sexual narratives is one of the ways that men learned about women's sexuality was from these fictitious narratives. And they were always about what was called starved women. And that was a woman, this is a theme that, that could continue, that it is evergreen. It's the woman who's insatiable. And so they would read this is like what every guy wanted, was to, read about someone completely insatiable. So it's interesting. I'm always interested in the ways, it's almost like there were these different spheres where they were interacting with sex workers. Then there were like women that they would have known from the towns that they were from. And then there was these fictitious voices that they were reading about in the smut, and, what was the intersection of all of that. But there's a great book, which I would hold up if anyone's interested in this time period, called Licentious Gotham by Donna Dennis, which I love. And it's all about smut south of 14th Street. We got a lot of hands.
Phil, just because you're top on my screen.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to ask Emily and Amy to talk a little bit about how their hunter experience shaped them and their careers as writers. But looking around the room, I'm actually going to flip that around, because I see our classmates Sharon Dinitz, Himani Singh, Yvonne Louie, Soraya Burnett, Elizabeth Devereaux, Marta Mary, Christina Boylan, Trissy Walliser, Kristen Sheehan, Michelle Kim, Tara Bonner James, and I'll even throw in Sarah Clements and Cassie Feldman because they're cool. And I just want to say that all of you not only sort of just remind me of how amazing hunter women are, but that the class of 1991 by far always had and always will have the most fly women of all Hunter alumni. So I'm going to raise a glass to you and thank you all for shaping my Hunter experience and being my friends.
I think we fucking love you, Phil. I think that's the appropriate class of 91 response. So
there's someone who's had her hand up for a long time. Pauline, did you want to ask something?
You got to unmute.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. I'm in Japan, and the governor of Tokyo, a woman governor, said recently that something along the lines of, we may be sort of in the same level as the Taliban occupied Afghanistan. I was a full professor in a university in Tokyo for 22 years. I taught women in the law, and I'm an American lawyer. And I am having a very tough time getting published. I'm earning pennies an hour. And I edit a 4-volume law treatise called Cybercrime and Security, hot topic. I make pennies. So I'm trying to switch to a trade publisher. I'm currently working on a project, and I do need to talk to Emily off later after this program, because we're looking at COVID. I have people from all over the world, but looking at COVID, and we have a whole team in Africa, and the Japanese government is very kind. There's an epidemiologist who studied at the University of Hawaii, and she is doing the Africa project. So we need to talk. And I contacted Dr. Birx recently and invited her because I need more epidemiologists on our team. Anyway, I have a publisher, but again, it's academic. I've published with them before, and the contracts are just horrendous. They prey on people who are academics. I'm no longer a professor. I was forced to retire because there's an age limit rule in Japan at each university. And I was thrown out 4 years ago, but I worked in Singapore for 2 years, lost my contract, and now I'm sitting in Kyoto working on 2 books. So the question is, how can I get an agent? And I've thrown out that question to people in my class, some of whom were agents, and then I never got an answer. I'm class of 64, by the way. One of the books that I want to do in the future is not, a happy book, but I attended Princeton before it was co-ed, and we're not treated as alumni. So I've been on that good fight for years, but I won't go into detail. But anyway, I'm looking for an agent. Yeah.
one thing just to say, because I know we have a bunch of questions,
Right.
and I'm really happy to follow up. I mean, I think
Right.
one thing, and Amy has been you know, far more prolific in terms of publishing than I have, so has her trajectory. I wrote an essay and somebody found it, and that was my story. I think writing the piece that is your calling card, getting it out there, reading the acknowledgments, figuring out who was the agent for the book that you love, and then sending them that essay, sending them that piece,
Okay.
making sure that it write the piece that reflects the idea, reflects the argument, and match it to people that did publish trade publications, you know, but also young, hungry agents are reading to find new ideas and new writers. So it goes both ways. If you get something out there, people will look for it.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left, so maybe we take one more question. You see any?
Mr. Zegers, weren't we your favorite class?
Yes.
There we go.
I think about it all the
Should we
time.
take one from Marilyn? Is your question quick?
Yes, it's quick. Hi. So I was really interested in your discussion about how pandemics intersect with women's reproductive organs. And I happen to be an HIV and COVID doctor in New York City. And
Thank
I'm
you.
horrified and baffled by this myth that COVID vaccines affect female fertility, preventing women from getting the vaccine. And I just would like to ask you why you think this myth has become so powerful.
So,
Good question. Good last question. Okay.
I mean, I think it's so funny because I was talking with my kids who are 8 and 11, and they're both male right now about this. I think that there's facts and truth. And I think that the truth is that for years, some women or many women or, you know, some people have had the experiences of injections and science that was bad for them and harmful for them. So there's that same reason, why do a lot of women think that Depo-Provera causes cancer or can increase your risk of HIV, and this is the shot that's given most frequently to Black and brown women in America and Africa. The facts are right now that it doesn't, but the truth is that if you live in a body where it has felt like the state has systematically either wanted to neglect you or tried to kill you, I think that sometimes those facts become a truth about life-saving interventions. That's what I think. That's how I understand it, which isn't a solution, but it's the way that I work into these things. And I will email you also, or you can find me, I'm mbass@gmail, and I have a website. But there's an amazing piece by a political prisoner named David Gilbert, who I think may get clemency and may soon be released. But he wrote a piece about AIDS genocide. He's white, he doesn't have HIV, but he's a prison AIDS activist who's incarcerated in the 80s, about how these myths are a form of genocide, you know, that the way that they're circulated actually is the genocide against people who ended up absorbing them, who need the healthcare. And it's a really interesting way of thinking about how do we not talk down to people and say, you're wrong, it's really good for you, but really understand that there's a whole sort of information economy that reflects white supremacy and the weaponization of this myth and administration by people who do want maybe Black people to die or people to not take the vaccine. So happy to follow up on that. Not an answer, just a restatement of the problem.
Thank you, Emily. So Kinshasa, it's 8 o'clock. Do we have to turn off?
I think we need to wrap up.
Okay. Well, I enjoyed this, everybody. It was wonderful. It was wonderful to be with all these people and to hear about the books and live in the world of Hunter for an hour and a half. It's great.
I don't
Thank
think
you too.
please buy
Kip,
the book.
so
I don't
much
think we
for,
brought the-
oh yeah, oh no, we gotta like stick that
books.
in the, okay.
Hold on. We'll figure that out.
Emily supports a store near her called Books Are Magic. I support Books Are Magic or bookshop.org, which is also independent. And we'll just vamp. Emily, is David Gilbert the father of Kesa Boudin?
He is. He is.
Okay.
But yes, please buy our books. Even if you don't read them, give them to somebody else. And then even if you do or don't read them, please review them. put your reviews on Goodreads, put them on Amazon, tell other people about them. That is just how the game works. And it's not a game.
Remember, everybody, that there are these favorite bookstores, but we all have to use hated Amazon. You can put me into Amazon and find out what I've been doing for the last 25 years. Order the books. I bought both of them, even though they were offered to be free, and I love both of them. Very impressive work.
Okay, I'm putting yours in the chat now too, Emily, for the, they're both
Beautiful.
in Books Are Magic.
Thank you, Kinshasa, and thank you, Alumni Association, and thank you, Amy and Mr. Zegers, for being part of this. It's just so wonderful to be in community now and then.
Okay, thanks to you
Okay, it
all.
looks like there's a link for those of us who want to continue the party.
Bye, guys.
Okay, good night.
Before we leave, thank you.